The night Hollywood learned that Rob Reiner was gone did not arrive with the quiet dignity people expected. It arrived like a rupture, sudden and disorienting, spreading disbelief through phone screens, studio offices, and living rooms across the world. One moment, Rob Reiner was a living monument to American cinema, a man whose films had taught generations how to laugh, how to hope, how to believe in justice. The next, his name was attached to a word no one was prepared for: tragedy. Alongside him, his wife Michelle, the steady presence who had walked beside him for decades, was gone as well. And almost immediately, grief gave way to something darker. Questions began to circulate before the shock had even settled. Questions about how this could happen and about what would come next. In the hours that followed, as police cars idled outside the gates of the Brentwood mansion and news helicopters hovered above the treetops, another story quietly prepared to take center stage. It was not about films, awards, or cultural legacy. It was about money, power, and a final decision made behind closed doors. Rob Reiner, the man who built a $200 million empire from stories about love and morality, had left behind a will that would soon fracture his family and ignite one of the most disturbing inheritance battles Hollywood had ever seen. At the heart of that will was a choice so unexpected that even seasoned estate lawyers struggled to explain it away. The largest share of Rob Reiner's fortune, an estimated 70%, was not divided evenly among his children. It was placed squarely in the hands of Nick Reiner, the son many insiders described as fragile, unpredictable, and deeply troubled. Nick, who had spent years battling addiction, instability, and failed attempts to find his place in the shadow of a famous father, was suddenly named the primary heir to a fortune built on discipline, control, and success. For the public, the timing alone felt unbearable. Nick was no longer just a troubled son. He was now the central figure in a criminal investigation connected to the deaths of his own parents. The idea that someone facing such accusations could also stand to inherit the bulk of a vast estate felt like an insult to common sense and to justice itself. Yet the will was real, its numbers precise, its intentions devastatingly clear. What was meant to be a final act of care became a spark that set everything on fire. As details leaked, outrage grew louder. Commentators debated whether Rob Reiner had acted out of guilt, fear, or unconditional love. Some insisted he must have known his time was limited and wanted to protect the child he believed would never survive on his own. Others saw something far more troubling, a pattern of rescuing without boundaries, of confusing support with surrender. The will forced everyone to confront an uncomfortable possibility. That love, when stretched too far, can become dangerous. Inside the Reiner family, the emotional shock was immediate and raw. Siblings who had already lost both parents in a single, horrifying moment were now faced with a second loss, the loss of unity. Grief did not bring them closer. It pushed them apart. Old wounds reopened. Long-buried resentments resurfaced. And hovering over everything was the question no one wanted to ask out loud. Did Nick know what was written in that will before the tragedy unfolded? California law offered a brutal twist to the unfolding drama. There exists a statute designed to prevent anyone from profiting from the death of a person they intentionally harmed. On paper, it seemed clear. If Nick were found responsible, he should inherit nothing. But law is rarely simple when mental health enters the conversation. If intent could not be proven, if awareness could be questioned, the door remained open. A loophole wide enough to swallow the very idea of justice. Hollywood watched in disbelief as grief transformed into calculation. Lawyers assembled. Documents were filed. Family members chose sides. And the fortune that Rob Reiner had spent a lifetime building, believing it would protect his children, now threatened to destroy them. The story was no longer about what he left behind. It was about whether his final act of love had unknowingly laid the groundwork for devastation. Silence, loss, and unresolved questions hung over everything. In that silence, one truth became impossible to ignore. This was not just an inheritance dispute. It was a warning, a reminder that even the most powerful legacies can collapse when love, money, and fear collide. Long before the headlines turned his family into a spectacle, Rob Reiner's life followed a path that seemed almost impossibly blessed. Born into Hollywood royalty, the son of comedy legend Carl Reiner, he grew up surrounded by writers' rooms, sound stages, and the quiet discipline of people who treated storytelling as serious work. Yet privilege never shielded him from pressure. From an early age, Rob understood that admiration was conditional, earned only through results. When he broke out as the outspoken, stubborn meathead on All in the Family, he was celebrated, but also boxed in. Fame came quickly, but so did the expectation that he would never escape that role. Instead of leaning into comfort, Rob made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He stepped behind the camera. Directing was not just a career shift, it was a declaration that he wanted control over his own voice. Film by film, he built a reputation not as a flashy auteur, but as a meticulous craftsman. He told stories about flawed people trying to do the right thing, about love tested by circumstance, about justice standing on fragile ground. When Harry met Sally, the Princess Bride, A Few Good Men, each success reinforced the same belief. That empathy mattered. That care and patience could shape something lasting. By the late 1980s, Rob had transformed creative instinct into empire. Castle Rock Entertainment became his fortress, a company built on consistency rather than chaos. It generated not just films, but stability. Royalties flowed year after year, long after premieres ended. Television deals, syndication rights, back-end profits, everything was structured to endure. Rob did not chase extravagance. He invested methodically, often reinvesting earnings into projects he believed in. Over time, the numbers grew almost quietly until they reached a scale few ever imagined. At home, he tried to bring that same sense of intention into family life. Friends described Rob as present, even when his schedule was packed. He showed up for school events, late-night conversations, moments that never made headlines. Michelle, his wife, became the emotional anchor of the household. Where Rob carried the weight of responsibility, Michelle carried patience. Together, they created a home that valued conversation, reassurance, and unconditional support. But that support was tested most intensely through Nick. From an early age, Nick struggled to find balance. While his siblings carved out independent lives, Nick drifted. He battled addiction, mental health challenges, and a deep sense of inadequacy that came from growing up under a famous name he could not replicate. There were stretches when he seemed to stabilize, moments when hope flickered. There were also long periods of relapse and disappearance. Rob and Michelle responded the only way they knew how. They stepped in again and again, housing him, funding opportunities, encouraging creative projects, refusing to give up even when others advised distance. To Rob, this was not favoritism. It was triage. He believed some children needed more help than others, and that fairness did not always mean equality. Privately, he worried about what would happen to Nick once parental support was gone. The entertainment world is unforgiving, especially to those who falter publicly. Rob had seen too many lives unravel after money dried up. That fear stayed with him, growing heavier as the years passed. His other children represented a different reality. They had stability, careers, families, and independence. They did not need rescuing. In Rob's mind, that difference mattered. He often spoke about tailoring support to circumstance, not dividing it by simple arithmetic. The fortune he was building was not meant as a reward. It was meant as protection. As he aged, Rob became more reflective. Friends noticed how often he spoke about responsibility, about leaving things in order. The will was not written in haste. It was revised carefully, shaped by years of observation and worry. By the time the final version was completed, Rob believed he had made the most compassionate choice available to him. He could not fix Nick's past, but he could try to secure his future. What Rob did not foresee was how that decision would look once filtered through tragedy. The context he carried in his heart did not survive the shock of sudden death and criminal accusations. The nuance vanished. What remained was a stark imbalance that felt cruel to those left behind. A father's attempt to protect his weakest child now appeared as a betrayal of the others. This is the tension that defines everything that follows. A lifetime built on empathy colliding with a legal system built on intent and consequence. A family shaped by love suddenly measured by percentages and statutes. The past, once a foundation, now pressing down with unbearable weight. The past finally caught up with the present on a cold December morning that no one in the Reiner family will ever forget. The Brentwood mansion, once known for quiet dinners and long conversations, became a crime scene sealed off by yellow tape and flashing lights. Inside, the unthinkable had already happened. Rob Reiner and his wife Michelle were gone, their lives ending in a way that felt violently out of step with everything they represented. Within hours, grief turned into shock, and shock into disbelief, as law enforcement confirmed that their own son Nick Reiner had been taken into custody in connection with their deaths. The news spread faster than anyone could process it. Friends, colleagues, and fans struggled to reconcile the image of a loving father and mother with the horror now unfolding. Reporters crowded the gates. Cameras lingered on the house where laughter had once echoed. For those closest to the family, time seemed to fracture. There was the life before that morning, and then there was everything after. As investigators worked through the details, another narrative began to surface alongside the criminal case. The question was no longer only what happened inside that house, but what Rob Reiner had put in place before his death. When the existence of the will became public, it landed like a second explosion. The document revealed that Nick, the very person now accused of being involved in his parents' deaths, stood to inherit the majority of their fortune. The timing could not have been worse. To many observers, it felt grotesque. To the remaining siblings, it felt unreal. Jake and Romy Reiner learned of the distribution not through a gentle family meeting, but through formal notifications and legal language stripped of emotion. Numbers replaced names. Percentages replaced memories. 70% to Nick, 20% to Tracy. The remaining fractions split between those who had believed they would be treated equally. Their initial reactions were not rage, but confusion. How could this be what their father wanted, knowing what they were now facing? How could a man so careful with words and meaning leave behind something that felt so violently unbalanced? As the shock wore off, confusion hardened into pain, and pain into anger. The will was no longer a private family matter. It was evidence in a moral trial being conducted by the public. Legal experts quickly entered the conversation, explaining California's Slayer Statute in careful, measured tones. The rule was simple in theory. A person who intentionally causes the death of someone they stand to inherit from cannot profit from that death. But the statute carried a crucial condition. Intent had to be proven. If intent could not be established, the door remained open. That single distinction transformed Nick's mental health history into the center of everything. Diagnoses that had once been discussed quietly within the family were now debated on television panels. Past struggles with addiction and instability were reframed as potential legal shields. Nick's defense strategy became clear early on. His attorneys signaled that they would argue diminished capacity, raising questions about his awareness and control at the time of the incident. For Jake and Romy, this was unbearable. They were forced to watch their brother's darkest moments turned into technical arguments, while their parents' deaths became hypothetical scenarios dissected for advantage. Their grief had no space to breathe. Every emotion was filtered through filings, hearings, and statements carefully crafted by lawyers. The situation grew even more volatile when Tracy Reiner entered the legal battle in her own right. As Rob's adopted daughter, she was legally entitled to the share he had left her. Yet her inclusion reopened old tensions about belonging and bloodlines. What had once been an unquestioned family bond was now scrutinized under the harsh light of inheritance law. Tracy refused to step aside. She argued that she had been present, supportive, and loyal through years of family struggle, and that her father's wishes deserved respect regardless of public outrage. Courtrooms replaced living rooms. Conference tables replaced kitchen tables. Each sibling arrived with their own legal team, their own version of truth, their own wounds. Motions were filed to freeze assets. Counterclaims were drafted. The estate itself became a battleground, its value measured not only in money, but in leverage. Meanwhile, Nick remained largely silent. His demeanor unsettled observers. He appeared calm, almost detached, as if insulated from the chaos surrounding him. Reports emerged that he had retained one of the most expensive criminal defense attorneys in Los Angeles, raising immediate questions about funding. How could someone with no stable income afford such representation? Whispers spread that Nick had access to trusts or accounts established long before his parents' deaths, suggesting a level of preparation that disturbed even seasoned investigators. Speculation spiraled. Some believed Nick was a tragic figure, shaped by years of illness and dependence. Now caught in a nightmare he could barely comprehend. Others saw a calculation, pointing to the timing, the legal strategy, and the potential loopholes that could preserve his inheritance. The line between vulnerability and manipulation blurred until it was impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. Psychologists weighed in cautiously, warning against simple conclusions. Mental illness, they explained, does not erase responsibility, but it can complicate intent. Addiction does not automatically negate awareness, but it can distort judgment. Each assessment added complexity, not clarity. As the case moved forward, the public reaction grew harsher. Sympathy shifted away from Nick and toward the siblings fighting to block his inheritance. Online, the story became a referendum on parental love. Had Rob Reiner's devotion crossed into enablement? Had his fear of losing Nick blinded him to the consequences of his choices? Through it all, one detail remained hauntingly constant. Rob Reiner's voice was absent. The man who might have explained, clarified, or softened the blow was gone. His intentions could only be inferred from a document written years earlier, now stripped of context and mercy. What began as a criminal investigation had evolved into a collision of grief, law, and legacy. The past, once filled with care and protection, now fueled suspicion and division. And as the legal battle intensified, one truth became impossible to escape. Whatever the courts would decide, the Reiner family as it once existed was already gone. As the legal battle intensified, the consequences of the tragedy began to spread far beyond courtrooms and headlines. What happened inside the Reiner family did not stay contained within legal filings. It rippled outward, reshaping relationships, reputations, and emotional lives in ways that no verdict could ever fully repair. For those left behind, the damage was not abstract. It was daily, intimate, and relentless. Jake and Romy found themselves living in a strange limbo, suspended between mourning their parents and preparing for war against their own brother. Grief, which normally demands solitude and time, was constantly interrupted by phone calls from attorneys, requests for statements, and reminders of upcoming hearings. Every memory of their parents now carried a shadow. A birthday recalled the last celebration together. A house triggered images of police tape and unanswered questions. There is no safe mental space where loss could be processed quietly. Emotionally, the toll was severe. Friends described Jake as withdrawn, sleeping little, replaying conversations with his father in his head, searching for signs he might have misunderstood everything. Romy struggled differently. Her pain surfaced in bursts, anger cutting through sadness without warning. She questioned not only the will, but her own place in the family narrative. If independence had cost her love, what did that say about the values she was raised with? Tracy faced a different kind of isolation. Her decision to defend her share placed her under intense public scrutiny. Online commentary painted her either as a loyal daughter standing by her father's wishes or as an opportunist exploiting a family disaster. The nuance of her relationship with Rob and Michelle disappeared behind simplistic labels. She mourned privately, while publicly bracing for judgment from strangers who knew nothing of her years within the family. The professional consequences were just as significant. Longtime collaborators of Rob Reiner expressed quiet discomfort. Studios that once spoke warmly about his legacy now avoided mentioning his name. Projects tied to his films entered a gray area, their celebratory tone replaced by caution. Film retrospectives were postponed. Tributes were reconsidered. No one wanted to appear insensitive by honoring a man whose family story had become so dark. Financially, the estate froze in place. Properties sat unused. Royalties accumulated but could not be distributed. Investment stalled. What was meant to sustain multiple lives now served no one. Advisors warned that prolonged litigation could erode the value of the estate itself, a cruel irony that further inflamed tensions. Every month of delay turned inheritance into attrition. The broader public impact was equally profound. The case ignited debate about inheritance law, mental illness, and moral responsibility. Talk shows and opinion columns dissected the same questions from opposing angles. Should compassion outweigh accountability? Should parents protect a vulnerable child at all costs? Does intent matter more than outcome? The Reiner tragedy became a proxy for unresolved cultural conflicts. Its complexity flattened into arguments designed for outrage rather than understanding. Psychologically, Nick's situation cast the longest shadow. Regardless of guilt or innocence, he became a symbol rather than a person. To some, he represented the failure of unchecked parental support. To others, he embodied the dangers of abandoning those who cannot function independently. His silence fueled speculation. His composure misread as either numbness or calculation. He existed at the center of the storm, yet remained unreachable, insulated by legal counsel and psychological evaluations. Experts warned that the prolonged exposure could deepen existing mental health struggles. Stress, isolation, and public condemnation are rarely neutral forces. Even if Nick's defense succeeded in mitigating legal consequences, the social cost was already irreversible. His name would forever be associated with suspicion and controversy. No inheritance could buy anonymity or peace. For the family as a whole, trust eroded rapidly. Communication became filtered through lawyers, each message stripped of warmth and reframed as strategy. Words that once carried emotional meaning were now parsed for legal risk. Silence replaced conversation. Distance replaced familiarity. The family unit, once held together by shared history, fractured under the weight of conflicting survival instincts. Observers closest to the situation noted a painful irony. Rob Reiner had spent his career telling stories about reconciliation, justice, and human connection. His final chapter delivered the opposite. A cautionary tale where love collided with law and produced only loss. The values he championed on screen now seemed painfully absent from reality, not because they were wrong, but because they were overwhelmed by circumstances he could not control. As months passed, the question shifted from who would win to what would remain. Even a decisive ruling could not restore what had been lost. Parents were gone. Siblings were estranged. A legacy built on creativity and compassion stood tarnished by association with violence and greed. The estate might eventually be divided, but the emotional debt would never be settled. In quiet moments, those who knew Rob best wondered if he would have changed anything had he seen the outcome. Would he have rewritten the will? Would he have placed firmer boundaries earlier? Or would he still believe that protecting his most vulnerable child was worth any risk? There were no answers, only consequences unfolding in slow, irreversible motion. Behind the noise of court filings and public outrage, quieter stories began to surface, fragments of memory and private moments that had never been meant for the world to see. These were not the dramatic scenes replayed on news channels, but small, human details that complicated the simple narratives forming around the Reiner family. Friends, former collaborators, and distant relatives started to speak in hushed tones, not to defend or accuse, but to explain what life had actually felt like inside that household long before everything collapsed. One longtime friend recalled evenings at the Brentwood home when conversation drifted late into the night. Rob would sit at the table long after dinner plates were cleared, listening more than he spoke. When Nick was mentioned, Rob's posture changed almost imperceptibly. His shoulders tightened, his voice softened. There was worry there, constant and unresolved. He rarely criticized his son in front of others. Instead, he spoke of possibilities, of patience, of time. He believed time could still heal what effort had not. Michelle, according to those closest to her, carried a quieter burden. She worried deeply about Nick, but she also worried about the toll it was taking on the rest of the family. There were moments when she suggested boundaries, small steps toward independence. Yet even then, she struggled to enforce them. Love, for her, was inseparable from protection. If Nick stumbled, she reached out. If he fell, she'd pull him back in. She once confided to a friend that letting go felt more frightening than the chaos itself. There were also stories of Nick that never made headlines. Periods when he showed genuine progress. Weeks of sobriety. Attempts to write, to create, to contribute. During one stretch, he worked closely with his parents on a film project meant to explore addiction and redemption. Those involved said the process was emotional, even healing at times. Rob believed deeply in the power of storytelling to save people. He hoped that by sharing something personal, Nick might finally find footing. But those moments never lasted. The progress faded, and disappointment returned. Each relapse left Rob more determined, not less. Friends questioned this approach, gently at first, then more openly. Some warned that constant rescue could prevent growth. Rob listened, but rarely changed course. To him, withdrawing support felt like abandonment, a line he could not cross. Jake and Romy experienced this dynamic from the sidelines. They loved their brother, but they also felt invisible at times. Not because their parents neglected them, but because crisis naturally commanded attention. They learned early to be self-sufficient, to manage their own lives without leaning too heavily on family resources. Independence became their identity, but it also came with a quiet cost. They internalized the idea that needing less meant receiving less. Years later, that belief returned with brutal clarity when the will was revealed. What Rob saw as tailored care, they experienced as erasure. Friends close to Jake said his anger was layered over sadness he had never fully expressed. He did not resent Nick for struggling. He resented the silence around his own sacrifices. Romy echoed this sentiment privately, admitting that she had always believed fairness would eventually balance everything out. The will shattered that belief. Tracy's private story added another dimension. As the eldest, she often played mediator, smoothing over conflicts, checking in when tensions rose. She had spent years supporting her parents in ways that were invisible to the outside world. Hospital visits, emotional labor, quiet reassurance during moments of exhaustion. When she defended her inheritance, it was not just about money. It was about recognition. She believed the will acknowledge contributions no one else saw. Even the handwritten note Rob left behind carried layers of meaning that outsiders missed. To some, it read as justification. To those who knew him, it sounded like a confession. He was not claiming perfection. He was admitting fear. Fear that without resources, Nick would spiral beyond reach. Fear that he would be gone and unable to intervene. The money, in his mind, was not a reward. It was a final attempt at guardianship. Psychologists familiar with family systems pointed out that the Reiner story followed a pattern seen in many households dealing with addiction and mental illness. The most vulnerable member becomes the emotional center, drawing disproportionate resources. Over time, roles solidify. One child becomes the caretaker. Another becomes the independent achiever. Another remains the crisis. When a parent disappears, those roles collide violently because the system holding them together is gone. What makes this story uniquely painful is its scale and visibility. Most families endure these struggles in private. The Reiners did not have that luxury. Every misstep became public evidence. Every private fear became a talking point. The subtlety of love and intention was flattened into headlines and hashtags. In these quieter stories, there is no clear villain, only people trying, failing, and trying again under immense pressure. Rob's choices were shaped by love and fear in equal measure. His children's reactions were shaped by years of adaptation to a system that no longer exists. The tragedy lies not just in what happened, but in what might have been said, acknowledged, or changed if time had allowed it. As the legal arguments grind forward, attention slowly drifts back to the question that lingers beneath everything else. What, in the end, did Rob Reiner leave behind? Beyond the money, beyond the court filings and accusations, there's a legacy shaped by intention, contradiction, and consequence. His life's work tells one story. His final decisions tell another. And somewhere between the two lies a lesson that is both deeply personal and painfully universal. Rob Reiner spent decades creating films that believed in the possibility of moral clarity. His characters struggled, but they learned. They argued, but they reconciled. Even when justice was hard-won, it was still reachable. That worldview was not an accident. It reflected how Rob wanted to see the world and how he tried to live in it. He believed people could be guided back from the edge if they were given enough understanding and support. He believed love, when offered persistently, could change outcomes. In his family life, that belief became both his strength and his vulnerability. Rob did not love conditionally. He loved fiercely, especially when things went wrong. With Nick, this meant refusing to give up, even when the pattern became destructive. From Rob's perspective, walking away would have meant accepting failure as final. He was not prepared to do that. His will was an extension of this philosophy, an attempt to ensure that even in death, he would still be protecting the child he feared for the most. Yet legacy is not defined solely by intention. It is defined by impact. And the impact of Rob's final act has been devastating. Instead of stability, it produced division. Instead of protection, it triggered conflict. Instead of reassurance, it left questions that may never be answered. This does not mean Rob was wrong in his love. It means that love alone, without boundaries, can sometimes create outcomes its giver never imagined. The tragedy forces an uncomfortable reflection on how families distribute care and responsibility. Rob's approach was deeply human. He responded to visible pain with resources and attention. But over time, that approach shaped a hierarchy of need that others quietly absorbed. Those who appeared strong were expected to endure. Those who struggled were rescued. When the system collapsed, resentment rushed in to fill the void. In this sense, the Reiner story is not exceptional. It is simply magnified. Many families wrestle with the same questions in private. How much help is too much? When does support become enablement? How do parents balance compassion with fairness? Rob Reiner faced these questions without a script, without guarantees, and under the constant pressure of public life. His answers were imperfect, but they were sincere. The legal battle will eventually resolve the financial questions. Statutes will be applied. Judgments will be rendered. Assets will be divided or forfeited. But none of that will resolve the deeper legacy Rob leaves behind. His children must now live with both the love he gave and the consequences of how he gave it. They must reconcile memories of warmth and guidance with the reality of estrangement and loss. For the public, Rob's story serves as a cautionary tale about the limits of control. Even those who shape narratives for a living cannot fully script their own endings. Success does not grant immunity from family pain. Wealth does not simplify moral choices. In some cases, it intensifies them. There's also a quieter legacy that risks being overshadowed. Rob Reiner's body of work continues to matter. His films still speak to themes of connection, accountability, and hope. They remind audiences that people are complex, capable of both kindness and harm. In a strange way, his family's tragedy echoes those themes with brutal honesty. Life does not resolve as neatly as stories do. What remains now is reflection, not only for the Reiner family, but for anyone watching from a distance. The story asks whether unconditional love should always be unconditional, whether protecting someone means shielding them from consequences, whether fairness can ever be separated from context. These are not questions with definitive answers. They are questions that must be lived with. Rob Reiner wanted to leave his children cared for, safe, and supported. He did not intend to leave them divided. Yet division is what followed. That paradox defines his final legacy. A man who believed deeply in love as a guiding force, undone not by its absence, but by its excess. The story now reaches a quiet edge, the place where noise fades and only meaning remains. What happened to the Reiner family cannot be undone by verdicts, settlements, or time. Even when the court doors finally close, the emotional reckoning will continue long after the cameras move on. This was never just a story about inheritance. It was about how love, fear, and legacy collide when the person holding everything together is suddenly gone. Rob Reiner spent his life believing that people were worth fighting for, especially when they were at their weakest. That belief guided his art and shaped his parenting. He did not measure love in equal portions. He measured it by urgency. Whoever seemed closest to falling received the most attention. In life, that choice felt compassionate. In death, stripped of explanation and timing, it became explosive. For Jake and Romy, the battle was never only about money. It was about recognition, about whether the quiet strength they built was invisible to the man they loved. Their anger came from grief layered with disbelief, from the feeling that independence had been mistaken for lack of need. Even if the courts eventually rule in their favor, the emotional wound will not close easily. Winning a legal fight does not restore trust or repair the sense of being overlooked. For Tracy, the conflict struck at identity itself. Her fight was not to take more, but to keep what she believed was rightfully acknowledged. In defending her share, she defended her place in the family story, refusing to let bloodlines redefine years of presence and care. The backlash she faced revealed how quickly compassion can turn into judgment when money enters the picture. And at the center of everything stands Nick. Guilty or not, responsible or impaired, he has become a symbol onto which the world projects its fears about mental illness, entitlement, and parental failure. If he is convicted, the law will likely erase his inheritance. If he is not, public opinion may never forgive him. Either outcome leaves him isolated, carrying a burden no inheritance can soften. His parents wanted to protect him from collapse. Instead, he stands alone at the center of it. The Reiner story forces a final reckoning with a painful truth. Love does not guarantee safety. Good intentions do not ensure good outcomes. Even the most careful planning can unravel when life takes a turn no one anticipated. Rob Reiner believed deeply in preparation, in leaving things in order. Yet the order he created depended on a future that never arrived. What lingers is not outrage, but sadness. Sadness for a family that lost its anchors. Sadness for a man whose legacy now carries a shadow he never intended. Sadness for the realization that some mistakes are only visible in hindsight, when it is far too late to correct them. For those watching from the outside, this story resonates because it reflects something familiar. Many families carry unspoken imbalances. Many parents worry about one child more than another. Many people believe they will have time to explain their choices. The Reiner tragedy shows what happens when that time runs out. Rob Reiner wanted his children to feel safe, supported, and loved beyond measure. That love was real. It shaped lives, created opportunities, and sustained hope through years of struggle. But love, when it becomes the only tool, can lose its ability to guide. Without boundaries, it can bend into something that no longer protects anyone. As the dust settles, one question remains, quieter than the rest, but heavier. If Rob could speak now, would he stand by his decision, knowing what followed? Or would he wish he had trusted his children to face the world with less protection and more equality? No one can answer that. Not the courts. Not the public. Not even his family. What remains is a legacy split in two. On one side, a body of work that taught audiences about empathy, justice, and connection. On the other, a final chapter that warns of how fragile those ideals can be when tested inside the home. The truth lies in holding both at once, without simplification. This is not a story with a clean ending. It is a story that lingers, asking viewers to reflect on their own lives, their own families, and the choices they might make when love and fear pull in opposite directions. And perhaps that is the most honest legacy of all.